Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about anthropology and decolonizing design. Today on the show, I am joined by the design anthropologist, public intellectual, and design advocate, Dori Tunstall. Dori is currently the Dean of Design at Ontario College of Art and Design and previously taught design and anthropology classes at Swinburne University and the University of Illinois, Chicago. I've been following Dori's work for a while now and was really interested in her background as an anthropologist and how that has influenced her work across many areas of the design field, from graphic design to interaction design to writing to teaching. Unlike some of the other designers who have been on the show who go on to study anthropology after working as a designer, Dori is the opposite. She comes from anthropology and brings this education into the design field, and that's where we start this conversation. We talk about her educational experience and how she discovered design and how design became a way for her to work through things she was thinking about as an anthropologist. We talk about what designers can learn from anthropologists and the shift that can happen from being the expert to being the student. And then we talk a lot about decolonizing design in the second part of this conversation. Dori has done a lot of work while at OCAD in decolonizing that curriculum and thinking through what it truly means to decolonize design and the design field. And I just found the way she's thinking about this incredibly smart and incredibly exciting. And so I'm really interested to find ways to incorporate some of these ideas into my own teaching as well. Remember, Scratching the Surface just relaunched our membership program over on Patreon. For the last few years, this show has been entirely supported through listeners. And so now we're making it even easier for you to help sustain the show. We're offering 3 monthly tiers for just $3 for students, $5 for patrons, and then $10 for superfans that give you all sorts of access to bonus content like a monthly newsletter, early episode releases, full transcripts of every episode, as well as exclusive interviews and bonus content each month. All of this helps financially support the show and helps keep it going. And so if you like Scratching the Surface, if you would like to see it continue and see more of it in the world, I hope you consider joining us on Patreon. You can visit patreon.com/surfacepodcast for all the details and to sign up and support the show. It truly means so much to me. Thank you, as always, for listening. And here is my conversation with Dori Tunstall. Describe yourself as a design anthropologist, and I would like to know what a design anthropologist is and how you kind of think about what a design anthropologist does.
So, as a design anthropologist, the easiest way to explain it is that I look at the relationship between values, design, and experience. So, I look at what are the values that we are wanting to articulate, let's say from a cultural perspective, how they're actually made manifest through design, right? So, we know we have a value because someone's designed something that gives us that experience of that value. And so this kind of goes into like an endless looping cycle where, I'll look values, design, experience. And then if there's a misalignment between the design and the experience, then we go and redesign it so that that's better alignment. But the place where I tend to operate is that I look at if there's a misalignment between the value and the experience, how do we go back and re-articulate a different set of values or alternative values and then create designs and experiences around them. And so the easiest way I talk about is like the work I did for Design for Democracy, which feels like such a long time ago. Again, so democracy is a value that we then experience through the ballots that we use, our interactions with the post office, the way we interact with a government building. And if our experiences of those designs are such that they don't make us feel like our vote counts, they don't make us feel like we are to be served, right? They don't make us feel like we belong in these spaces as kind of citizens or whatever, then those things need to be redesigned, or we need to really think about is democracy the actual value that we're putting forth in our society, right?
I'm interested in especially in hearing that answer, where design came into your life. I've talked to many designers who have gone on to study anthropology or realize that their work is anthropological in nature. I probably am guilty of that
Hmm.
also.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
you are the opposite. You're somebody who studied anthropology, both undergrad, graduate, PhD is in anthropology
Yeah,
too, isn't it?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, where did
Well,
where did the design part kind of fit in there, or how did that come
well,
in?
I mean, I think it started with art, right? So I've always, as a kid, I always did art. And that always I would say what that meant is that I was always interested in the relationship between form and content and context, right?
Mm,
So I would go and, even in my undergrad or in my grad studies, like you have to do like a weekly response to the readings or something.
right. Yeah.
And I would submit a drawing or a comics, strip, or a wall of text in terms of like a well-formed argument and essay. And so, and again, I didn't even wasn't even aware of the term design in that same sort of way that I am now. I just knew that the form of things was
Mm,
just as important as the content that I was putting forth. So when I did my PhD, every chapter had a different form. So I did my PhD in Ethiopia. I did my PhD research in Ethiopia, and so what I was doing was using a lot of the vernacular forms of expression. So when you go to the north of Ethiopia, for example, they have in the churches they tell the story of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon in this kind of comic strip. Well, not comic because it's not comedic, in this kind of graphic strip form, right? So I had an entire chapter that was telling kind of a story about like, well, interracial miscegenation between Italy and Ethiopia in that comic strip form. And then, like in the east, you have so the city of Harar, which is one of the fourth holiest cities in the Islamic faith. And in fact, like the Prophet Muhammad, when he was kicked out of Saudi Arabia, he actually was a refugee in some ways in Ethiopia. And um, so in that chapter was designed in the form of Quranic surahs. And again, the content was all the content of my observations
right.
of
Right.
what was going on in the city, but it was done in the structure of a Quranic
That's
surah,
so
like as if you
interesting.
were reading
Yeah.
the page. And again, and then I did weird things where like I had side notes instead of footnotes because I'm like, but it just makes more sense to read side to side. Why would you go to the bottom or go to the end, right?
Right. 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 That's so
And then
interesting.
and again, this is again, and it wasn't like I wasn't, like I didn't hang out like at design at Stanford or anything. I just knew that like the form of these things mattered and how they get communicated. And if I'm going to build this content of knowledge, I need to give it the most appropriate form that speaks to the experience of being there and interacting with it. Then I went to go work into high tech consulting, and I remember coming into eLab, right, which is where I started, and that eventually became Sapient. And I remember coming to eLab and they showing me kind of all the work, and I'm like, I found my people. They're designers. These
Right.
people they're called designers. No wonder I've been feeling so alienated in my anthropology department. Like nobody understood me. I mean, I would get bonuses for like the drawings that I would do on the edge of my foot, but no one really understand me. And suddenly I have people, we speak the same language and they understand me, right?
Before you went to eLab, or maybe as you were doing that, as you were studying anthropology, was there a goal? What does someone who studies anthropology, what do they go on to do usually?
You go on to teach anthropology in the university, and you go and do more research and write books and all those things about the places that you've visited. So I intended to do that, but again, I always did it in different ways. Even as an undergrad, for I it wasn't so I did the project I did before I did my thesis. I told the story of Prometheus and Homo habilis, right? because Homo habilis was the early human, right, that discovered
Hmm.
fire, how to use fire. Um, I created actually a puppet show,
Okay.
and I was working with this puppeteer, so Robert Smythe. So I made from scratch bunraku, which are Japanese form
Yeah.
of puppet. I made from scratch these beautiful sort of uh, Javanese inspired shadow puppets. I
Mm.
made all these sort of costumes. I, learned how to make a fire safely. And I told the story using masks, which I made, and puppets. And that to me, like, like the thesis that I did, like the following year in my senior year, I still think is inferior to the thesis that I presented
Right.
through that puppet, like, again, deeply informed, studied, researched um exploration of what's the human relationship to fire, right?
That's exactly kind of where I was taking that question about what someone who studies anthropology go on to do, because I imagined it was write books, write academic papers, teach, and I was curious if this kind of experimenting with form, whether it's comics or puppets, was that seen as a barrier to that, or was that accepted, or did you get pushback to kind of presenting this research in different ways?
So going back to my PhD dissertation, the comment when I turned it in was that I didn't break any rules, but afterwards they're going to have to rethink the rules of how you do it, right? So
Mm,
I stayed within their notion of what the format was, but I did, like I said, I did all kinds of weird things. Like I said, side notes versus footnotes. I did, this was like we could have desktop publishing, so I had all these images
mhm,
everywhere.
mhm.
Um, that I had entire passages that were in Arabic Ghia script, right? Because you had now that through the computers, you had the technology to be able to do that, right?
Mhm.
So it was a thing where one of my dissertation advisors said, um, "It's a good thing, Dori, you're a genius." Because I actually don't know what to do with this, but I know you're brilliant and you're smart, so I'm just gonna let it
Hmm.
go.
That's not bad. I guess that's a compliment.
Yeah, it's a little backhanded compliment, but it's,
Yeah.
well, my thing is that they didn't they so I said there was difficulties, and I did have to have the conversation saying it's like, I could write you a traditional dissertation, right? In my
Mhm,
first
mhm.
chapter, I wrote imperfect academies just to
Mhm.
show that and to explain why the rest of this is not going to look at traditional academies, because I have this
Yeah.
relationship between form, form, content, and context, right? So
Right.
I did all that explanation in perfect academies, and then I just went again. I expressed things in the way that I thought was most appropriate for who I was trying to embrace, which was not my professors. I was trying to embrace the Ethiopian community who had generously shared with me these stories. So I wanted to give it back to them in a form that would resonate with them, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I was thinking when you were saying that. I was thinking about your answer about what design anthropology is, and the sometimes, gap that we see in the values and the experience. And in a way, the academic paper is kind of an example of that, in that
Mm-hmm.
the academic paper often, or academic, writing in general, is exclusive, is dense, is for a specific audience. And by rethinking that medium, you
Mm-hmm.
you open it up to different people, and so you were kind of enacting what would later become your career in a way,
Yeah,
through those like thesis dissertations. we're
yeah.
I don't mean to
No, no,
I,
it's good.
I don't mean to. I don't want this to sound like I am against, anthropology or academic,
Well,
you
as
know, framework.
anthropologists, though, like like the thing about I think is cool about studying anthropology is that in other disciplines you are the expert,
Mm.
The thing is that being an anthropologist is that the 5-year-old who belongs of that culture is more of an expert than you are.
Okay. Right.
And
Well,
so there's a built-in humility that comes with being to being trained as an anthropologist that I think works against some of our notions and expectations of what it means to be an academic, right? Like
right.
you don't dress up in a suit or whatever. You're normally dressed up in some, sandals and whatever that's comfortable
Hmm.
for you. Your expertise only comes in some ways sharing the deeper knowledge that everyone else that you spoke to has about a culture or situation. And you're just more of the storyteller and the traveler, right, to communicate those stories where they and it goes both ways. Like I was telling lots of stories about life in the United States when I was in Ethiopia, and then telling stories about life in Ethiopia when I was back in the United States, right?
You started answering exactly what my next question was going to be, because I think you're speaking a bit about how design, and I don't mean to put design and anthropology as two separate things necessarily, but how
Hmm.
design can help tell the stories that you're telling as an
Yeah.
anthropologist, how it can shape them, how you can communicate them to a specific audience or group of people. And I'm kind of curious about the flip side, what designers can take from anthropology. And you were starting to say that about that kind of humility about asking
Hmm.
questions.
Hmm.
But are there other things from that kind of early education of yours that you think applies to design?
Well, in the work that I was doing, in my theorization that I was doing, like in the early 2000s or so, I talked a lot about the yin and yang of design
Mm,
anthropology. So I used
hmm
to like go to AIGA conferences every year, and I would talk about the yin and yang of
hmm
design
hmm
anthropology because in some ways they work really. So again, yin yang coming from Taoist principles, and so drawing upon that as a metaphor to talk about the way in which design and anthropology interacts with the world. So like, anthropology being about yin energy where you're sitting back, you're observing, you're letting kind of like the experience of the world flow through you,
mm,
where design is kind of yang energy where you're kind of pushing forward, you're intervening, you're interacting in the
mm,
world. And so I always talked about you need to have that balance, right? So if you're all yang, then you could be really destructive. And we can see from what we're doing to the environment, what we've done to sort of cultures, like how bad all of that pure yang energy could be. But if you're just sitting back and observing things and you're not trying to bring forth any positive change in the world, that's just as bad, right? So you need to have that balance, which is constantly dynamic and shifting between that energy of I'm gonna I'm gonna learn, I'm going to absorb, I'm going to understand in a deep way. And then I'm going to use that understanding to be able to act in very specific ways with great intention in order to
hmm
do what is right for the the stakeholders in some ways of whatever
right.
experience that I'm trying to co-create with them, right?
Something that comes up on the podcast often, and a topic that I'm just personally very interested in, is this notion of the what I call the designer savior complex. That the designer can just come in
Yes, that I
and
criticize all the
yeah,
time. I
yeah, and
criticize that all the time.
this. I mean, in talking about the kind of humility of the anthropologist, I think we can contrast that with the often arrogance of the designer. That design can solve any of these problems, and design alone can solve any of these problems. The designer can go into just drop themselves in anywhere in the world and problem solved. And what I think what's interesting that you're saying, and that I agree with, is that design also is the or it sometimes is part of the cause of those problems also.
Mhm.
And that this idea of kind of designer top down change no longer works, if it ever did work.
It never
um,
worked. It never worked.
and on the podcast, I talk a lot about this idea that design is ideology made artifact, that it's taking these
Mm.
ideas, points of view, ways of seeing the world, and it's turning them into reality. Design is not a purely intellectual activity. It actually
Hmm.
has kind of like real world impacts. And I'm wondering how you think about that, both as someone who is kind of like rooted in the design world now, but with that kind of anthropological background,
Hmm.
how we can start as designers to, reshape those hierarchies, rethink our role in the process of solutions, but also our role in causing the problems. How do you start to kind of articulate that and kind of chart a way forward through that?
Um, Kind of one of the really fundamental text of my intellectual influence is this book called Thinking with Things by Esther Pastore. And so
Mm,
Esther Pastore is some ways a design anthropologist, an art anthropologist. And what has struck me, and I've taught about this, and I reference it all the time, is this notion that aesthetics is our first technology of control, and
mm,
thus our first technology of power. And
mm.
what aesthetics does is it controls our relationship to the human world and socially with each other, but also it was our technology in some ways to try to control our relationship to the natural world as well.
Right.
So within that framework, she talks about how again, at different levels of social organization, we have different aesthetics, and I won't go through that whole entire thing because it's a good argument. You could go read it.
Yeah.
Um, but
We'll
for
put a link
me,
on the
yeah.
episode page.
But for me, what's important to communicate that to young designers is to understand like aesthetics, which as a designer you have expertise in
Right.
aesthetics, right? That is
Right.
your expertise to know what material to use, to know what form to give it, to know how it needs to flow and interact. Like that is the knowledge that you have greater than other people.
Right. Right.
That is
Yeah.
where your value comes, right? That aesthetics is a technology. It's a technology in the same way that the computer is a technology,
Mm-hmm.
pencil
Mm-hmm.
is a technology, and as a technology, it is meant to do something. So, what are you having it do? Right? Are you having it trying to convince other people to follow this brand as if they would follow a powerful leader? Are you using it to create a sense of like harmony and understanding? Because again, technologies do whatever you intentions you set for them to do, right? Um, and so for me, that understanding and I do it in the context because everyone's like, oh, you're a designer, go make this look pretty, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
pretty, let me show you pretty, right? Because pretty is about aesthetics. So that pretty can decide whether or not people are going to buy your products or not. That pretty is going to decide whether or not we understand this information about the climate. This is going to have people able to fill out your form online, right? So all this prettiness, all this aesthetics is real power. And so this is the part where I can understand designers are like, yes, we will solve everything, right? Um, but again, is you have to understand what it is your intentionality around what it is that you're seeking to control, which means you control two things, right? You control your relationship to the natural world. So you have to understand your relationship to the natural world, right? So that's where sustainability becomes important because sustainability is about how do we rethink our relationship to the natural world? Do we pollute it? Do we extract from it without giving things back? Do we create a sort of cycle in which things actually flow with one another? Because nature itself is really good in terms of making sure everything has its purpose and place and use in creating harmonious systems of flourishing for everything, right? um and then our social relations, right? Because I do talks now and I talk about these are the ways in which design has been harmful. Every time we have issues of appropriation and misappropriation of indigenous culture, that's design being harmful. you know every time when we talk about some new exciting efficient invention that only serves to replicate or deepen a master slave relationship, and
Right.
a lot
Right.
of our technology, right, Siri, go fetch this. Siri,
Mm-hmm.
150 years ago, would have been a black woman
Right.
going to go get
Right.
that for you, right?
Right.
So
Right.
anytime we build those kinds of relationships, that's design doing harm, right? Anytime we put up racist propaganda, that's design doing harm. So for every time, I love pulling out these examples every time someone's like, design's going to save the world. It's like, well, can first design save the box of pancakes, which has been causing me pain for the last 40 years because it keeps representing
Right.
this slavery narrative in a nostalgic way that is about the degradation of my peoples.
Right. I
Once you
mean, it's
solve that
so
one, let's talk about solving the rest of the world.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, you are 100% right, and you can look at every one of those uh personal assistants on our devices, and the fact that they're gendered female is
Hmm.
encoding, we're seeing this kind of ideology both implicitly and explicitly in some cases. And I don't mean to, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, and I don't mean to kind of gloss over all of your work, but you're a little bit similar to me in that you worked kind of in the industry for a bit before returning to academia like myself. And I'm interested in how these questions manifest themselves for you in the classroom. And the reason I ask that is two reasons. One, um, I often have students who are just like, I just want to get a job. I just want to be a designer. I just want to get a job. I want to like learn the skills that I need so I can get a good job. And I think that's a totally valid question. But I also push up against that because I also want to talk to them about all of these other questions. And that balance is something that I'm kind of constantly thinking
Hmm.
about.
Hmm.
And how you I'm interested in kind of even on a curriculum level. You're a dean at OCAD, so you're kind of looking over all this across all different types of design fields. Also, how do you think about not just bringing these into the curriculum as like an add-on, but actually reshaping how we teach design so this is kind of core to the design project in a way?
Well, I mean, that's the work we're doing at OCAD when we talk about decolonizing
Hmm.
design, right? That we want to produce respectful designers,
Hmm.
right? Um, and again, I'm a dean, and even though most deans don't teach, I make sure I teach every year. Actually, this year, because of COVID, I'm teaching two classes. I've taught because I've had to do some backup. And the class I'm teaching right now is actually our third year advertising class, and I'll use that as an example to talk about like how you do it. So, um, in the advertising class, it's kind of like three layers of narrative that's going on. There's the layer of like this is the advertising process. So you go from a return brief, you develop three concepts, the client chooses one, and then you do a proof of concept for, in this case, they're developing a digital brand strategy. So that's kind of like the normal narrative. There's a sub narrative that's happening because I've paired the groups of students with indigenous and black small businesses that are being negatively impacted by COVID because they need to shift to digital. So their clients are not large corporations or even large agencies who ask us to do projects on their behalf. Their clients are people for whom this work will be directly meaningful because it is helping them think through the kinds of problems that they have in terms of how to make their business work in this context of COVID, right?
Right.
And they're black and indigenous, which because it brings us to the level of what's happening in the course, where we're doing all these critical readings around how advertising has been harmful
Mm,
to
mm,
black and indigenous communities. But also I'm bringing in black and indigenous and other POC special guests to talk who are work, like last guest was Forrest Young, who's
mm, mhm.
chief global chief design director
Yeah.
for Wolf Olins, and he talked about like how they do work, but how they do work in ways that are meaningful to embrace the diversity of individuals and communities that they need to embrace. Right? We have Mark
Mhm, mhm.
Rutledge, Mark Rutledge, who's a Ojibwe designer, and he walked us through a project where again it's like what was really special is that we did all these community consultations. We made sure that the imagery that we use, we couldn't trust the archival imagery around Indigenous people because we knew it was staged. So we had to create this new imagery. We built in language, so the website was in English, but it was also in um, Anishinaabe, so the Anishinaabe language, right? So we were bringing in these individuals who can talk about like what it means to be a indigenous Black POC person
Mm,
working within the industry, how
mm,
the industry has changed, and
yeah.
then what are the 3 or 5 tips that they need to understand as young people to be able to have their presence continue the transformation of the industry. So that's a
Hmm.
class I'm teaching each
Yeah,
week,
that's so interesting.
every Wednesday, and that's how you bring it all together, right? So it's like, again, we're following like the advertising process, but we're setting up this meta conversation theoretically around what advertising has or has not done, but we're taking that theoretical critique and we're putting it into real life practice, because you have to develop, you can't reproduce those stereotypes, because your client partner will have be able to respond back to you to say this is a little misguided, right?
Can you talk a little bit about the process of decolonizing that curriculum? And again, the reason I'm asking that question, I'm kind of curious about y- basically like how it how it went over. Was there pushback there? I mean, and
Oh,
I'm
there
asking that
always
because
is. Yeah.
like I've definitely seen schools that are, progressive liberal in urban areas that, still do design histories that are, all the white designers. And when there's some challenge there, they want to make sure that we're talking about, Paul Rand. um, and I'm kind of curious how that process has been for you and how you've seen it actually kind of like change how the students are thinking about these things, and maybe
Well,
even the faculty too, honestly.
Well, I mean, it's the faculty that has to change, and then the students are the one who support and advocate and become the reason for the change. So, first of
Mm,
all, it's a long process. It can accelerate pretty quickly, but it's a long process. So, even before I've been at OCAD about now 4.5 years. So, even before I arrived, there was a lot of work that individual faculty members did to help prepare the institution for these changes, and we had government things that shifted in Canada. So we had the uh, Truth and Reconciliation Committee recommendations around addressing Indigenous history and knowledge and ways of being and language in the curriculum. And so that's where a lot of the work started. The institution had the president at the time, Sarah Diamond, established a task force on underrepresentation of faculty, so they could gather the data, but also set up the programs that allow us to bring in diverse faculty into our body. Um, and then I think I came in some ways, like the advantage of being a design anthropologist, I feel, is that I can accelerate processes of change. And I do so because the anthropology gives me a background to understand people, their values, what's going on, like how the system and the structures are all working. And then design gives me the opportunity to find that point of leverage in order to sort of shift or pivot again
mm,
and communicate the necessity of that shift and pivot in a way
mm,
that allows people to find their places in the change and be able
mm-hmm.
to move forward, right? So I use my
Right.
design anthropology skills every single day as
Yeah.
a dean. And I'm very, and it's very interesting, right? Because there's a way in which the institution has adopted a lot of the practices that I that I've brought in
Nice.
around sort of
Yeah.
methodologies of like, why are we sitting and having this conversation? Let's get out the post-it notes and whatever. Now we do digital
Right.
post-it notes and
Right.
workshopping through things, and so they've brought those practices in there as part of, again, in some ways, the transformation in and of itself. Like, why are we sitting in this
Yeah.
meeting, everyone giving PowerPoint presentations, no one actually listening? Why are we not working together to figure out what the solutions will be, not just listening to the problems forever and ever, right? Um, within so to get back to sort of the directness of your question, there's a lot of work. So we had to work with faculty to understand what decolonization means. So we had like a whole year and a half where we were like, let's have panel discussions on what decolonization means. What does it mean to me? What does it mean to you? We brought in external experts around the kinds of who could model some of the kinds of curriculum changes that we would want to aspire to. um, then we had to bring in the faculty, and it's the we had in the indigenous cluster hire. So we brought in for design our first three full-time indigenous faculty members, and so they did the work helping their colleagues understand the perspectives and the lived experiences that they bring and how they can be brought into the curriculum, right? We just last year we had the Black cluster hire bringing in our first 5 Black faculty members, and they're doing the same sort of thing, saying this is what the Black experiences is, this is what it means, this is how I see design, and this is how I'm building that into the curriculum. And let's all share together around the things that you could bring into the curriculum, because you may not have the lived experience or the expertise, but these are some of the concepts that are free for you to use. And then these are the things that are sacred, that if you don't have the lived experience or expertise, you probably shouldn't be bringing those into the classroom. But
Right.
you can bring also I mean, the thing about decolonization is that it decolonizes everyone. Like, so there's a lot of amnesia that happens even in European history in the way in which they present themselves. Because if you had to leave your home country to come somewhere
Mm,
else, there is
mhm,
trauma in that process of leaving. And
mhm,
so
mhm,
that whole
mhm.
notion of like, I'm going to forget where I came from was in some ways a trauma response to whatever was happening in Europe that required your grandparents, great grandparents, or whatever to be able to leave. So
Yeah.
there's a process of sort of cultural reclamation that actually has to happen among the European students as well, so that they can share in that
Yeah.
heritage with others without hierarchy, right? Equally without
Right.
hierarchy.
Right.
So decolonization in some ways is about dismantling the hierarchy that says that European aesthetics, European ways of
Yeah.
thinking,
Yeah.
European ways of expressing are the model to which everyone aspires to. To sort of say,
Right.
there's
Right.
basically come as you are, come as you share. We will value it all, but with the underpinning of indigenous ways of thinking and knowing, because indigenous ways of thinking and knowing allows for and affords for that sense of relationality without
Mm.
hierarchy, right?
I have a very specific question that I want to make sure that I ask carefully
Mhm.
and phrase the way I'm thinking about it. And even just your previous answer helped connect things that I have been trying to articulate and wrestle with as a teacher, as a white male teacher in classes of primarily not white male students, and thinking about
Mhm.
that hierarchy and how I am in the classroom and the readings that I bring in. And you've talked a lot about separating design from the kind of modernist project, and I think
Mhm.
especially modernism in graphic design um, is still held up, speaking of hierarchies, as kind of, the pinnacle of design. All design is kind of critiqued against that.
Mhm.
And when I teach design history, I was realizing that I was kind of subconsciously doing that. I've been trying to, move away from chronological histories, kind of
Mhm.
moving away from this happened, then this happened, then this happened, trying to get away from this is still what we consider good design.
Mhm.
Because that project was, the international type style. It was it was universality. It was about erasing these differences. It was about, all this stuff that you're talking about. And I think, to be honest, I think I've done a pretty good job of thinking about that historically and how to do that. But then when
Mhm.
it actually comes to the classroom and work being made today, I have found, both in myself and when I see other critics giving feedback, or other teachers giving feedback, that we still, consciously or not, fall back on that as the criteria. Um, and so we can talk about decolonizing design history. We can talk about indigenous knowledge. We can talk about the Black experience, or hear about the Black experience. But then when it comes to actually looking at students' work, we're still like, oh, it needs more white space, or can you simplify
Well,
this, or the grid. And how do we connect though? Like, I don't
so
I'm
I mean, this is
you
where
know what
you
I
have to,
mean?
yeah. I mean, like this is where as a teacher you have to do the work to be able to connect with where your students are,
Mm,
and I think about it this way: is that my role as an instructor is to understand the intentionality
mm-hmm,
of
mm-hmm.
the student, and then to be able to guide them and coach them of where that intentionality is made manifest or not made manifest.
Right.
And that's how you get away from putting it against some quote unquote objective standard,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
right,
mm-hmm.
of aesthetics. Is like, no, what is, who are you, where you come from, what are your intentionalities, who are you trying to communicate to, what are the ways in which they prefer to communicate, and
Right.
then again trying to guide them through the processes of saying, well, you're saying that you want to do that, but it looks like you're trying to do this,
Mm-hmm,
or,
mm-hmm.
and sometimes again you may not have enough of the knowledge or expertise, so you guide them to sort of say, well, put it up on Instagram, send it out to
Right.
a bunch of people that you think with it, and then see what their response might be, because again what you're
Right.
trying to gauge is you have an intentions that you're trying to make manifest in the world. Is it
Mm-hmm.
coming through in the way that you expect
Yeah.
it to, right?
Yeah.
And you only know that by, um, again, embracing the main people you're trying to communicate. And sometimes as an instructor you can be a kind of an avatar for the lack of clarity in their ideas, and then
Right.
prompt them in some ways to go back and think, is this my true intentions, or is this the way in which I need to express this intention? Maybe I can try something too, and give them the
Yeah.
confidence to take the risk to find
Right.
the multiple ways to express it, again coming out of their authentic sense of self, right?
Right. And that in a way, also flips these hierarchies and flips this, the dominant critique format in the classroom, because it's no longer about defending the work, or arguing the work, or pleasing the professor, which, like, hopefully it never is, but there's always a
Hmm.
little bit of that. And it becomes a project for the whole class. Like, in talking about, like, this way, it's like everybody has to kind of be then thinking about this. It's
Yeah.
not just this kind of dialogue between professor and student. It's then that changes how everybody is giving feedback, which I really like that idea.
One of the things I loved when I was teaching at University of Illinois Chicago is that I would go to sort of the art and design and architecture critiques, because they were all sort
Mm,
of scheduled at the end of the semester, and it was one of those things like, uh, I hadn't realized that like I had become a favorite critic, right? That the students would like when I had not like students would sort of say to me like once I left University of Illinois Chicago, where like they were like, I really missed having you in critique, or if I was a one that I couldn't attend because there was a conflict, they were like, we really
mhm.
missed you in critique, and I was trying to understand like why do you miss me in critique?
Yeah.
And they said in the way that again we're talking about is that the kinds of questions I asked were never about, again, are you
Yeah.
meeting this objectivist standard, you need to have more white space or whatever, like, or the literature of this is blah blah blah. The question I would always
Yeah.
ask would be like again, like, well, who are you trying to embrace with this, and what's your intentionality, and then like what's like the wider cultural ramifications of this if you
Yeah.
put it out in the world, and then if it's something really private for you, like then what are the boundaries that you're putting in place between what, and so like they were like you would bring like a whole different level of conversation around the
Hmm.
work that no one else asked us about, and we didn't have to think, and all of a sudden we had to think about these things, right? And so I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
more of that would be, and again it requires work. Like when I work with students I have to do a crash understanding of whatever is the cultural things that they're doing, and then again there's a lot of humility, right? Because I they are the experts in their lived
Right.
experiences. They are the experts in that which they're trying to express. My job is just to coach them to help get that
Right.
out of them, right?
Right. Right. I'm curious what you're thinking about right now. Where are your kind of research interests? What are the topics that are exciting you? What's kind of next for you at this
I
point?
mean, there's no next. I'm still deeply, deeply engaged in like this process of decolonizing, design education and scaling it, and what does it mean, and what are the structures that need to be in place, and how is it constantly evolving? I mean, we've had this, we were having conversation, some colleagues and I the other day around like how like before, when I came to Canada, I learned the term BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, and
Mm,
POC. Which again, coming from the States, I'm like, well, but we're all people of color, and like people of color was invented by Black women in order to create a more inclusive structure for those other women who shared similar interests. So how all of a sudden Black people get excluded from POC, right? um, and learning again the specificity of why it needed to exist here. But we were talking about the fact that like now there's kind of this evolution that's happening in this term where it's like say
mm,
PIC, where Indigenous wants to be first, and
mhm,
POC, they're like, oh, but we need to break it all down because now you put us all together and we have
mhm,
differentiations too. And so in this process of kind of like decolonization, diversity, equity, inclusion, what I'm thinking about is how, as our sophistication increases around these ideals,
mm,
that the terms are shifting, the goals um, um, are different, and the kinds of alliances and coalitions that are being built are much stronger. Um,
mm,
and so I'm really fascinated by this journey of evolution around these ideas, especially as
mhm,
now, coming out of the events of this summer with the murder of
mhm,
George Floyd and the resurgence of Black Lives Matter, our sense of disconnected yet connectedness because of COVID-19 and social
mhm,
distancing,
mhm, mhm.
how those things are all kind of coalescing into
Yeah.
a new understanding of what our relationships need to be with each other and with the environment. And that's what decolonization is really about, is that
Yeah.
articulation of a new set of relationships, which again, basically, without hierarchy, and by not having that hierarchy, you create the space for indigenous sovereignty.
My last question, which is the question I used to end all of these conversations, I would just love to know what you're reading right now.
I don't get to read. I'm reading student essays. That's what I'm reading. So I would say the book that I've been reading lately and I'm gonna is My Grandmother's Hands, Resma Menachem.
Mm,
Uh, so he's a trauma specialist. I think he's been
yeah.
mentioned maybe otherwise,
Yeah.
a trauma specialist. And coming out of the events of this summer, like his articulation of the way in which the body understands trauma, and that the Black body experiences trauma in a particular way, the white body experiences trauma in particular, and the police body experiences trauma in a different way. And there's a kind of triangulation of relationships between those
Mhm.
positionalities that explain our social dysfunction right now. It's been very valuable for me to read as a way to kind of understand the moment that we're in and how
Right.
we've been in this moment for a long time. But it was also very valuable for me to read and understand because it's a workbook, right? So it's a workbook of how you work through
Mm,
that trauma, how you process, metabolize that trauma so that you are not so that you're responding to the world with a sense of clarity, and not responding with that sense of trauma based fear that shuts down your capacity to think and feel, right?
right.
So I've been reading and going, and the fact that it's a workbook for me is super irritating because I'm a person like who just like reads the books, like
Yeah. Yeah.
plows through
Yeah.
books, and it's like, no, before you go to the next chapter, you have to do 10 minutes of humming and breathing exercises. And I'm like, no, I want to get to the next bit of knowledge, right? So it's
Yeah.
been also a good discipline for me in terms of getting out of my head and into my body,
Mm,
and forcing myself to, because especially if you're um, very active and busy in the way that my life is structured to be, taking those moments to just breathe and reflect, and being forced to do so is part of how I stay clear and healed, so that I can be a source of clarity and healing and understanding to others, including my faculty, my staff, the university itself, as well as all of the students to whom I am responsive to, right, as a leader.
hmm I think that's a beautiful way to end this conversation. Dori, thank you so much. This was such a great conversation. I love this so much. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Jarrett.
This episode was recorded on February 17th, 2021. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.